There's this really powerful idea, this historical drive that you hear about in certain circles, the idea of actually finishing the task of Christian mission.
Right, seeing it through. And a really key moment that brought this into focus was that gathering in Tokyo back in 2010. The whole point was looking at this idea of closure.
Exactly, closure. What does it mean? How do we get there?
And what's so interesting is how that single goal, closure, actually brought together so many different, well, perspectives on what engagement really means, how you connect with people groups.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we've got some fascinating reflections from someone who was, right in the thick of those discussions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and their viewpoint is pretty unique because they're deeply familiar with both that whole closure movement and what's known as the insider movement approach. So it's a really nuanced lens.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Someone who gets the drive for measurable results, but has also seen faith pop up in ways that maybe don't fit the standard boxes.
Precisely. So our mission today, if you will, is to unpack all the complexity around measuring things like engagement and reachness in global missions.
It sounds simple, but it's really not.
Not at all. We need to look at the different ways people define these terms, especially after Tokyo 2010, and how our maybe evolving ideas about what church even is kind of impacts everything. Okay, let's get into it, starting with that big vision of closure and Tokyo 2010.
Okay. Well, Tokyo 2010, the timing was very deliberate. It was actually one of 4 big events that year, all marking the centenary of the Edinburgh 1910 conference.
Which was a huge deal in mission history.
A massive deal. And Tokyo's specific focus was squarely on this idea of finishing the task.
Right, and this is where we really see the closure movement gain momentum. It was this idea of, okay, let's get organized, let's get mission groups and churches coordinating to figure out how far the message has actually spread and work together to reach those groups still considered unreached or unengaged.
And importantly, they saw themselves as part of a long story, They weren't trying to invent something totally new.
They explicitly connected it back.
Yeah, they referenced earlier meetings like Singapore 2002, the AD 2000 movement, the foundational work of people like Ralph Winter on identifying hidden peoples.
McGavran, too.
McGavran, definitely. And going way back, Edinburgh 1910, those big missionary pushes in the 18th, 19th centuries, and ultimately the Bible itself.
It's like saying, we stand on these shoulders, now let's finish it. And a massive part of that push involved collecting data. Lots of data.
Oh, absolutely. A huge emphasis on tracking people groups. Do they have access to the message? Are there resources in their language? Have any local faith communities started? Stuff like that.
But here's where it gets tricky, right? The data wasn't always uniform.
Exactly. You had different organizations, finishingthetask.com, the IMB's research arm, Joshua Project, all doing crucial work, but sometimes using slightly different definitions.
So different criteria meant different numbers.
Yeah. Potentially different statistics about who was reached or engaged, depending on whose list you looked at, which really leads us to Ralph Winter's work.
His definitions of people groups, that was pretty influential.
Hugely influential. He proposed those 4 ways of looking at it. Blocks, ethno-linguistic peoples, socio-peoples, and Unimex peoples.
Can you give us a quick rundown?
Sure. So blocks are those massive cultural spheres, like the Muslim world. Ethno-linguistic is probably what most people think of distinct language and ethnic groups. Socio-peoples were kind of larger peer groups.
Okay.
But Unimex is really interesting. That's the largest possible group where the core message could potentially spread naturally, like a movement, without hitting major roadblocks, language barriers, big cultural divides, that sort of thing.
And the crucial point there, as Winter himself said, was that we don't actually know how many Unimax peoples there really are.
Precisely. So even within the framework designed to help categorize for closure, there was this built-in acknowledgement of, uncertainty. How do you measure the completion of a task when the units you're measuring are themselves a bit fuzzy?
Right. So did Tokyo 2010 try to sort that out? Pick one definition.
Not really. According to the source we're looking at, it seems they acknowledged the different databases existed, the different definitions were out there, and kind of encouraged leaders to just use them all. Consult everything available.
Okay, so accept the complexity, but there was still a clear call for action, wasn't there?
Oh, yes. A big push was for mission leaders to commit their organizations to specifically engaging certain unreached groups over the next 3 years, focusing on starting local faith communities.
And collaboration, too.
Yeah, working together on strategic things, like getting resources like the Jesus film out there more widely.
So a real drive for coordination and measurable effort towards closure. But then Our author, with their background in the insider movement, starts asking some deeper questions. This is where it gets really fascinating.
It really does.
Yeah.
And it's key to remember, this author isn't trying to tear down the closure movement. They say explicitly they're friends of the movement. Their own organization, Global Teams, shares the goal of seeing local faith communities established.
They even use the same metrics sometimes, right? That Southern Baptist scale.
Exactly. They use that scale, focusing on those really early stages, level 0 to 2, for pioneer work. So they're operating within that same world using similar tools.
But their experience with insider movements made them question the assumptions behind the measurements.
That's it. They started asking these really basic but profound questions. What is a local faith community really? What counts as planting one? What makes a team or a strategy focused on that?
And even bigger questions.
Yeah, like what do we even mean by evangelical Christianity or just Christianity? Because the answers probably differ quite a bit, even among people committed to closure.
Which brings us back to the data. If everyone's defining the terms slightly differently.
Then what are we actually measuring? The author really emphasizes the need for clarity on criteria if the data is going to be meaningful for tracking progress towards closure. And they bring in that distinction Ralph Winter made between measurability and verifiability.
The AIDS analogy. Explain that again.
Winter's point was you can verify if someone has AIDS, but you don't really talk about measuring how much AIDS they have.
Okay.
So applying that to mission, maybe we can verify if a people group is reached in the sense that there's some kind of believing community there, but perhaps we can't precisely measure how reached they are. It shifts the focus a bit, doesn't it?
It does. From a number on a scale to a more yes-no question of presence. Okay, so let's dive into this insider movement perspective then. This seems crucial to the author's questions.
Right. And the author notes they actually prefer terms like movements to Jesus within Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism. That phrasing itself tells you a lot.
It emphasizes remaining within the community.
Exactly. People following Jesus, forming intentional groups of believers, but staying within their birth, religion, and culture. And the author speaks from like 20 plus years seeing this happen in an Islamic context.
That's a significant experience.
It is. And they share this amazing story. They call them the Jedi People Group, obviously not their real name.
Right, for security.
Yeah. So this group, the Jedi, were on the list as unreached. Churches started praying for them. Standard procedure, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what happened next was, well, not standard.
Okay.
Before any outside groups could even launch a strategy, it turned out that leaders from within the Jedi people had already become followers of Jesus. And they just sort of naturally plugged into existing leader training events through relationships they already had.
Wow. So completely organic.
Totally organic. It kind of bypasses the whole strategic planning model in a way. It makes you wonder, as you said, how often that might be happening under the radar.
So on paper, they're unreached. But in reality, God's already working.
Precisely. And this story brings out some really key points. First, the Jedi people didn't see themselves as this isolated unit that the lists defined them as. They saw themselves as part of a much larger ethno-linguistic group.
More like Winter's Unimax idea.
Exactly. So the way outsiders carved them up for planning didn't match their own sense of identity. That's a big challenge for list making right there.
Definitely.
Second, engagement happened through relationships, from the inside out, the emic perspective, how they sought themselves, not from the outside in, etic strategy. And the author stresses, again, those lists are based on the best reported info. What's reported isn't always the whole story.
There could be a lot missing.
A lot. And third, this whole thing challenges the definition of local faith community. If closure relies on planting these communities, what counts? The movement the author saw studied scripture, like Acts 2 and Acts 14, to figure out the essential functions: teaching, fellowship, breaking bread, prayer, leaders.
But not necessarily the form, not the building, the weekly service time.
Exactly. They focused on the core activities, not a specific structure. So these communities were flexible, meeting times, places, sizes varied. They often emerged from existing social networks, families, friends.
Which means they might not show up on surveys looking for, like, a church billing address or a pastor's name.
Precisely. They don't fit neatly into the data boxes we often create.
So how does all this reality on the ground challenge how we measure engagement and reachness? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. When were the Jedi actually engaged? when an agency put them on a list, or when believers within their group started following Jesus and meeting together.
The author clearly argues for the latter, right? That these internal movements count as engagement.
Yes, it broadens the definition significantly, and it makes it harder to say when a group is reached if our idea of a planted church is based on external forms that these movements might not have.
They question the whole idea of needing a certain number of churches or believers, calling it maybe biblically arbitrary.
Yeah, instead of just counting, they point back to those functions in Acts 14, evangelizing, discipling, encouraging each other, appointing leaders, staying connected.
Focus on the verbs, the actions, not just the nouns, the structures.
That's a good way to put it. That framework lets you see the core elements of community happening, even if they look different, maybe even happening within the context of another religious tradition.
Okay, so given all this complexity, what kind of approach or posture does the author suggest for the closure movement, folks?
They propose 4 helpful postures. First is Gamaliel open. Remember Gamaliel in Acts? He basically said, hey, let's be careful. If this is from God, we can't stop it. If not, it'll fizzle out.
So an openness to God working in ways we don't expect or maybe even fully understand yet.
Exactly. An awareness that these spontaneous movements might be genuinely God-breathed.
Okay, what's next?
Second, security closed. This is crucial. Whatever your theology about these movements, the people involved are often at serious risk.
Yeah.
So extreme confidentiality is non-negotiable. The author mentions, tragically, that reported information has sometimes led to terrible consequences for believers. That's a really sobering point.
It really is. Utmost care is needed.
Third is grace-tongued. Basically, speak the truth in love, especially when discussing these different approaches to mission and theology. Handle disagreements with grace.
Something we can all probably work on?
Probably. And fourth, biblically reformed. This is a call to constantly go back to Scripture and re-examine our assumptions about church and community.
Acknowledging that our backgrounds, our denominations, shape how we see things, and nobody has the perfect picture.
Right, a call for humility and willingness to learn and adjust based on the Bible, not just tradition.
That sounds like a really balanced approach. Intellectual honesty, practical caution, relational grace, and biblical grounding. Okay, so we've seen Tokyo 2010 and the closure focus, and these questions arising from insider movements. Let's widen the lens again and bring in that other big 2010 event, Cape Town.
Right, Cape Town 2010. It's useful to see them side by side. Tokyo was billed more as a celebration, really focused on that disciples of every people goal, coordinating for closure, big numbers, lots of countries represented.
And highlighting that shift of Christianity to the global south.
Definitely. Plenaries, workshops, they produced the Tokyo 2010 Declaration, the Last Mile Calling Project followed up. It was very action-oriented towards that closure goal.
And Cape Town, different vibe.
Yeah, Cape Town was framed as a congress aiming to rekindle the Lausanne movement spirit. The theme was reconciliation. From 2 Corinthians 5, much more focus on global participation, dialogue.
They had those table groups,
Yeah.
right, for discussion.
Exactly. And a massive use of technology, the Lausanne Global Conversation online beforehand, a global link during the event, trying to connect the whole global church.
So Tokyo is maybe more about the what's finishing the task, and Cape Town more about the how and the who reconciliation, the global body.
That's a fair way to put it. Cape Town also vividly showed that Global South shift leadership, testimonies, worship styles, though it was poignant that delegates from China couldn't attend, and there was that incredibly powerful testimony from a North Korean believer.
Wow. Reminders of the cost involved. And Cape Town produced a major document too.
Yes, the Cape Town Commitment, which has become a really significant guiding document for many, much like the original Lausanne Covenant.
So if we compare Tokyo and Cape Town, and maybe even look back a century to Edinburgh 1910, what stands out? Similarities? Differences?
Well, some striking similarities across all three. Major gatherings of mission agencies. A central focus on world evangelization, completing the task. Similar numbers of delegates, actually.
And primarily Protestant evangelical involvement.
Mostly, yes. Limited or no Orthodox or Catholic participation, though Cape Town did have some Catholic observers. And fundamentally, all three affirmed that mission is absolutely central to what the church is.
But the differences must be huge, especially over 100 years.
Oh, massive. Just look at the numbers. A dramatic decrease in the estimated number of unreached people groups compared to 1910. Explosive growth of evangelicals in Latin America, Africa, Asia.
The demographics have totally flipped.
Completely. The ratio of evangelicals to non-evangelicals globally is much better. And maybe the biggest shift, missions ending. In 1910, it was almost entirely west to rest. Now, the majority of cross-cultural workers come from the majority world.
That's incredible. Plus, we have way better resources now, right?
Yeah.
Data, technology.
Vastly better. And the whole mindset has shifted, moving away from a kind of territorial, almost military approach towards what's being called diaspora missiology.
Okay, you mentioned that before. Tell us more about diaspora missiology.
It's about focusing on people on the move, migrants, refugees, international students, etc. The thinking is when people are uprooted and in transition, they're often more receptive to new ideas, including faith. So it's not just about ministering to the diaspora, but seeing them as partners. Ministering through their existing networks back home and in the new place, and mobilizing them as missionaries themselves, both locally and globally.
So it breaks down that clergy-laity divide in mission.
Very much so, in that context. It sees everyone as having a role. It's not replacing traditional missions, but it's a vital complementary strategy for our globalized world.
And the other big insight you mentioned was the relational paradigm.
Yes, this came through strongly, especially at Cape Town. It emphasizes that heart commitment comes before action. Heart, head, hand.
As opposed to just jumping into programs.
Right, maybe a contrast to some Western pragmatism. It focuses on relationships as the core framework. Our relationship with God, vertical with each other, horizontal, and through our networks.
And Cape Town's theme of reconciliation fits right in.
Perfectly. That, and their deep dive into the book of Ephesians. It tapped into what many see as a deep hunger for genuine connection and relationship in the 21st century.
So pulling all these threads together, trying to measure engagement and reachedness is clearly way more complicated than just looking at a spreadsheet.
It absolutely is. You've got these different mission approaches. You've got God working in surprising organic ways. You've got this massive shift in global Christianity and this deep emphasis on relationship. Our old metrics might struggle to capture all that.
Which leaves us with a really provocative question, doesn't it? Considering how dynamic faith movements can be, especially these relational insider ones, how do our traditional ways of measuring success need to change? How do we make sure our maps reflect the actual territory of God's work?
It's the core tension, isn't it, between the need for strategic, data-informed planning and the reality of faith spreading organically, relationally, often unseen by the official trackers.
Yeah. But it's good to end on that hopeful note you mentioned from Tokyo 2010, that vision from Genesis, God's promise to Abraham, people from every single nation, tribe, and tongue worshiping Jesus.
Exactly. And maybe, just maybe, a more nuanced, relationship-aware understanding of what engagement and reachedness truly mean actually helps us see that vision becoming reality in ways we hadn't considered before.
Yeah.